The Silver Spoon Bistro went quiet. The sound of forks against plates stopped as Sarah Johnson's hand caught Ronald Parker's wrist. "He stays." Her voice was soft but firm. The restaurant manager's face turned red, his silk tie suddenly too tight. In 15 years of running Boston's fanciest restaurant, no server had ever challenged him, especially not in front of the Thursday lunch crowd of bankers and wealthy regulars. "Take your hand off me, Sarah." Ronald's whisper promised trouble. Between them stood Walter, an old man in worn clothes, his rough hands holding a frayed cap. Despite looking homeless, his eyes were clear and watchful. He smelled of rain and city streets, nothing like the restaurant's fancy food aromas. "I've already seated this gentleman at table 7 and taken his order," Sarah said, moving between Ronald and Walter. Her uniform was clean, but her worn shoes told the story of someone who stood for hours, counting every tip. "It's all taken care of." Around them, customers exchanged uncomfortable glances. At a corner table, Mrs. Wellington raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that the girl putting herself through nursing school? Always refuses my extra tips." Ronald looked across his perfect dining room. White tablecloths, shining silverware, expensive lunch specials, before staring again at Walter's old coat. "This place has standards," Ronald hissed, grabbing Sarah's elbow and pulling her aside. "Do you know what the Carmichael party at table 9 spends here every month? They don't pay to eat next to street people." Sarah glanced at her watch, a simple timepiece with a cracked face. 4 more hours in her shift. Rent was due tomorrow and her mother's medication wouldn't refill itself. Her whole life balanced on the edge of not enough money. Yet she stood taller. "I already paid for his meal with my card," she said steadily. "No one will be bothered." Outside the big windows, a sleek black car stopped across the street. The driver, in a perfect uniform, stepped out and looked toward the restaurant before checking his watch. Walter's rough fingers touched the small pendant visible beneath Sarah's collar, a simple medical symbol. "Nursing? 4th year?" he asked quietly, his voice surprisingly educated. Before Sarah could answer, Ronald snapped, "That's it. Both of you, out. Now." As heads turned throughout the dining room, Sarah felt years of swallowed pride rise in her throat. This moment was where dignity and survival crashed together. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, pale against hospital sheets, trying to smile through pain. "I'm sorry, Mr. Parker, but I won't throw him out." Sarah's voice didn't shake. "He's a human being who's hungry." Ronald's nostrils flared. "Then you're fired. Return your apron and collect your final check on Friday." Before we continue, comment from where you are enjoying the story. The dining room grew so quiet Sarah could hear the kitchen fans humming. Walter stood perfectly still, his eyes moving between them. "I was planning to quit next month anyway," Sarah lied, untying her apron slowly. "After nursing boards." A young busboy named Miguel watched with wide eyes from behind a service station. Sarah had helped him learn English during shared breaks. Now he looked down at the floor, afraid to make eye contact with Ronald. "Your mother must be proud," Walter said quietly to Sarah as she placed her folded apron on the hostess stand. Sarah's eyes snapped to his face. "I never mentioned my mother." Walter just smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. Ronald stepped close to Sarah, voice low but harsh. "You've wasted 3 years here. I gave you flexible scheduling for your classes. This is how you repay me? By embarrassing me in front of my customers." Sarah thought of all the double shifts, the missed study sessions, the times Ronald had changed her schedule last minute, forcing her to scramble for class coverage. The scale inside her, always balancing gratitude against reality, finally tipped. "Thank you for the job, Mr. Parker. I served every customer who walked through that door with respect, even when they didn't return it." Sarah turned to Walter, whose meal was already being delivered to table 7 by a confused server. "Sir, I'm sorry about this. Please enjoy your lunch." Ronald grabbed her arm again. "He is not staying." "I've already paid. You can keep the money, but he eats." Sarah gently removed Ronald's fingers from her arm. unless you want to make an even bigger scene by physically removing an elderly man from your restaurant. Ronald's eyes darted around the room. Every customer was watching now. Mrs. Wellington had her phone out. "Fine," he spat. "He can eat. But then you both leave. And don't think about using this place as a reference." Sarah nodded once, dignified despite her racing heart. As she walked toward the employee area to collect her things, Miguel whispered, "I'm sorry, Sarah." "It's okay," she replied, though it wasn't. Her mother's medication cost $340 a month, even with insurance. Their apartment was $1,200. School was another $4,500 this semester, due in 2 weeks. The calculations crashed through her head like falling bricks. When she returned, Walter was eating soup carefully, his back straight, manners impeccable. She noticed his hands again, worn but clean, nails trimmed neatly. There was something about him that didn't quite fit the narrative Ronald had assigned him. "May I join you?" she asked. Walter looked up and smiled. "I'd be honored." Sarah sat across from him, aware of the stares. "I'm sorry about what happened." "Don't be," Walter said, breaking a piece of bread. "Jobs come and go. Character stays." "That's a nice thought, but character doesn't pay rent." Walter's eyes, a clear, intelligent blue, studied her face. "Tell me about your mother." Sarah startled. "How did you—" "People reveal more than they realize." He took another spoonful of soup. "You touch that pendant when you're worried. It was a gift from her?" Sarah nodded, fingers automatically finding the small silver caduceus. "When I got accepted to nursing school, she worked double shifts at the hospital cafeteria for 20 years to save for my education." She swallowed hard. "She got sick last year. Cancer." Walter nodded, his eyes softening. "And now, you're the one working double shifts." Sarah looked away. "Life happens." "Indeed it does." Walter finished his soup, dabbing his mouth with the napkin in a strangely refined gesture. "Thank you for the meal, Sarah. It was a kindness I won't forget." She shrugged, embarrassed. "Anyone would have done it." Walter's smile held secrets. "We both know that's not true." He nodded toward Ronald, who was apologizing profusely to the Carmichael party. "Some see only what's on the surface. Others see humanity." As they walked toward the door together, Sarah felt strangely calm despite the disaster that had just collapsed her carefully balanced life. Outside, the black car Sarah had noticed earlier was still waiting across the street. As they reached the sidewalk, Walter turned to her. "Where do you go from here, Sarah Johnson?" She blinked, surprised he knew her last name, then remembered her name tag. "Home. To figure out how to tell my mother I got fired for feeding a homeless man." Walter smiled again, this time with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Perhaps there's more to this story." As he spoke, the driver of the black car stepped out and nodded respectfully in their direction. "There always is," Sarah said, "but right now I need to catch the bus." Walter nodded. "Until we meet again, Sarah." She turned toward the bus stop, unaware that in exactly 1 hour, everything would change. Sarah unlocked the door to their small apartment and took a deep breath before stepping inside. The familiar scent of her mother's lavender candles, a small luxury they still allowed themselves, made the place feel like home despite its peeling paint and drafty windows. "Mom, I'm back early," she called out, setting her bag down and arranging her face into something that wasn't despair. Ellen Johnson sat in her favorite armchair by the window, a crochet project in her lap. At 52, her once vibrant red hair had faded, sprinkled with gray that had appeared mostly in the last year of treatments. She looked up, her hands stilling. "Sarah?" What happened? A mother's intuition, sharp as ever despite the medications that often clouded her thoughts. Sarah sank onto their worn couch. "I lost my job." Ellen's fingers tightened around her crochet hook. "Ronald finally pushed too far?" Sarah smiled despite herself. Her mother had never liked Ronald Parker, had seen through his false smiles from the first time she'd visited Sarah at work. Something like that. She told her mother the story, watching Ellen's face shift from concern to pride. "That's my girl," Ellen said when Sarah finished, "standing up for someone who needed it." "That's your daughter who now has no income," Sarah corrected gently. "The rent's due Friday, and your medication—" "We'll figure it out," Ellen interrupted, the same thing she'd said when Sarah's father had left them 15 years ago, when college tuition had seemed impossible, when the cancer diagnosis had come. "We always do." Sarah nodded, not mentioning the student loans she'd already maxed out or the credit card that was nearly at its limit. "I'll start applying for new jobs tonight." Ellen studied her daughter's face. "Tell me about this Walter. There was something different about him?" Sarah thought about Walter's perfect manners, his educated speech, the way his eyes had seemed to see right through her. Yeah, something didn't fit. His clothes were old but clean. His hands were rough but well kept. "Not everyone on the street started there," Ellen said softly. "I know." Sarah stood and walked to the kitchen, opening their nearly empty refrigerator. "I'm going to make some tea. Want some?" As Sarah filled the kettle, her mind replayed the morning's events, lingering on Walter's parting words. Perhaps there's more to this story. The black car across the street. The driver who had nodded at Walter. The kettle whistled, pulling her from her thoughts. As she poured the hot water over cheap tea bags, a knock sounded at their door. "Are you expecting someone?" Sarah called to her mother. "No," Ellen replied, setting aside her crochet work. "Mrs. Diaz sometimes brings over tamales on Thursdays, though." Sarah opened the door, expecting their kind neighbor. Instead, she found a tall man in a crisp uniform, the driver from the black car. "Miss Johnson?" His voice was polite, professional. "My name is Thomas. Mr. Blackwell requests the pleasure of your company." Sarah gripped the doorframe. "Mr. Blackwell?" "You would know him as Walter, miss." Behind her, Ellen had risen from her chair, moving slowly to stand at Sarah's side. "The homeless man?" Sarah asked, confusion clear in her voice. Thomas's expression remained neutral. "If you would be so kind as to accompany me, Mr. Blackwell can explain everything himself." Sarah hesitated. "I can't just get in a car with a stranger." "Of course, miss. Perhaps this will help." Thomas handed her a business card, embossed in simple black letters. Gregory Blackwell, Blackwell Foundation. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Even she recognized that name. The Blackwell Foundation funded hospitals, schools, and homeless shelters across the country. "Mom?" Sarah turned to Ellen, who was studying Thomas with shrewd eyes. "I think you should go," Ellen said after a moment. "I'll be fine here." "Actually," Thomas interjected, "Mr. Blackwell has requested your presence as well, Mrs. Johnson, if you're feeling up to it." Ellen straightened, dignity in every line of her body despite her worn robe and slippers. "Give me 5 minutes to change." 20 minutes later, Sarah found herself sitting beside her mother in the back of the most luxurious car she'd ever seen. The Rolls-Royce moved silently through Boston traffic, its interior smelling of fine leather. "Where are we going?" Sarah finally asked when the silence stretched too long. "Back to the Silver Spoon Bistro, miss," Thomas replied, catching her eye in the rearview mirror. Sarah stiffened. "I'm not interested in seeing Ronald Parker again." "Mr. Blackwell thought you might say that," Thomas said with the faintest trace of a smile. "He asked me to assure you that you would find the experience worthwhile." Ellen reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. "Life can surprise you, sweetheart. Sometimes you just have to let it." When they arrived at the restaurant, Thomas opened their door and offered Ellen his arm. She took it gratefully, her strength depleted by even this small excursion. Sarah followed them, her stomach knotted with anxiety and something like curiosity. Through the restaurant's windows, she could see that the lunch crowd had thinned. Only a few tables remained occupied. Ronald Parker stood near the hostess stand, his back ramrod straight, his expression strained as he spoke to someone Sarah couldn't see. Thomas opened the door for them. As they stepped inside, Sarah finally saw who Ronald was talking to. Walter. Except it wasn't quite Walter anymore. The man who had entered the restaurant in ragged clothes now wore an impeccably tailored suit. His silver hair was neatly combed, his weathered face clean-shaven. Only his eyes remained the same, clear, blue, and watchful. When he saw Sarah and Ellen, he turned away from Ronald with obvious relief. "Ah, Sarah, Mrs. Johnson, thank you for coming." His voice was the same educated tone she'd heard before, but now it carried authority rather than humility. Ronald's eyes darted between them, confusion and dawning horror on his face. "You know each other?" Gregory Blackwell, not Walter anymore, smiled. "We met earlier today, though under somewhat different circumstances." He turned to Sarah. "I believe Mr. Parker has something he'd like to say to you." Ronald's face was now the color of old paste. "Miss Johnson, there appears to have been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Gregory interrupted smoothly. "You fired this young woman for showing basic human decency. I was there, Ronald. I saw everything." "Sir, if I had known who you were," Ronald began. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Gregory's voice hardened slightly. "The way you treat people shouldn't depend on who you think they are." The few remaining diners were watching openly now. Forks paused midway to mouths. Sarah felt her cheeks burning, but Ellen stood tall beside her, chin lifted in quiet pride. "I test people, Ronald," Gregory continued. "I found it's the only way to see who they truly are. Sarah didn't know who I was. She simply saw someone who needed kindness and offered it without hesitation." He glanced at Sarah. "Do you know how rare that is?" Ronald swallowed visibly. "Mr. Blackwell, I assure you, the Silver Spoon values all our customers—" "Spare me," Gregory cut him off. "I've been watching this restaurant for weeks. You've turned away homeless people from your doorstep, even when they only asked for water." Ellen's hand tightened around Sarah's. Gregory turned to them. "Mrs. Johnson, I understand you're not well. Please, sit down." He guided Ellen to a nearby table, pulling out a chair for her with the same perfect manners he'd displayed as Walter. Sarah sat beside her mother, feeling as though she had stepped into someone else's life. Ronald hovered nearby, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Sarah," Gregory said, "I wasn't entirely honest with you earlier. I'm not homeless, though I was once, many years ago." His eyes grew distant for a moment. "After my wife died, I lost everything. My will to work, my house, eventually my dignity. Someone showed me kindness when I needed it most." He refocused on her face. "I never forgot that lesson." Sarah found her voice. "So you pretend to be homeless? To test people?" Gregory nodded. "I do it several times a year. Most people either ignore me or treat me with contempt." He glanced at Ronald, who flinched. "What you did today was extraordinary, especially considering what it cost you." "It was the right thing to do," Sarah said simply. "Yes, it was." Gregory smiled. "And now I'd like to do the right thing, too." Ronald stepped forward eagerly. "Mr. Blackwell, if there's anything the Silver Spoon can do—" "You've done quite enough," Gregory said firmly. He returned his attention to Sarah and Ellen. "I understand you're in nursing school, Sarah." "4th year," she confirmed. "Graduating in May if I can make the last tuition payment." "And after that?" Sarah glanced at her mother. "I was hoping to specialize in oncology nursing, to help people like Mom." Gregory nodded thoughtfully. The Blackwell Foundation funds a scholarship program for nursing students with financial need and exceptional character. I'd like to offer you a full scholarship that would cover your remaining tuition and provide a monthly stipend for living expenses. Sarah's breath caught. "Mr. Blackwell?" "Gregory, please." "Gregory," she amended. "That's incredibly generous, but—" "Consider it repayment for the lunch you bought me," he said with a small smile. "The foundation also has connections with Boston Memorial Hospital. They have an excellent oncology department where your mother could receive treatment." He looked at Ellen. "At no cost to you." Ellen's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you do this for strangers?" "Because 15 years ago, I was at my lowest point," Gregory said quietly. A nurse named Rebecca Jenkins found me sleeping behind the hospital where she worked. Instead of calling security, she bought me coffee, listened to my story, and helped me find a shelter. That small kindness saved my life. He looked at Sarah. When you stood up to Ronald today, you reminded me of her. Sarah couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. There is one condition, Gregory added. I'd like you to work with the Blackwell Foundation after graduation. We fund health clinics for the homeless, and we need good nurses. Sarah looked at her mother, who nodded almost imperceptibly. I would be honored, Sarah said, finding her voice at last, but I don't understand why you would go to such lengths just to test people. Gregory smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. The world is full of Ronald Parkers who judge people by their appearance, their status, their bank accounts. But it's the Sarah Johnsons who change lives. Ronald cleared his throat. Mr. Blackwell, surely there's no need to be hasty. Sarah is an excellent server, and we would be happy to reinstate her position immediately with a raise. The transformation in Ronald's attitude would have been comical if it weren't so transparent. Gregory turned to him, his expression cooling. Ronald, I think you misunderstand the situation. I'm not here to negotiate Sarah's return to your establishment. I'm here because your treatment of people reveals a deeper problem with the culture you've created. Ronald's smile faltered. Sir, I assure you. I've made up my mind about another matter as well, Gregory continued as if Ronald hadn't spoken. The Blackwell Foundation hosts quarterly charity dinners for our major donors. We've used the Grand Plaza for years, but I think it's time for a change. Ronald's eyes widened as he grasped the implication. Foundation events were prestigious, expensive affairs that could transform a restaurant's reputation and bottom line. The Silver Spoon would be honored to host such distinguished events, Ronald said quickly. I wasn't offering, Gregory replied. I've been looking for a restaurant with both excellent food and excellent values. This place has only the former. Sarah watched Ronald's face fall and felt a twinge of sympathy despite everything. She knew the restaurant business operated on thin margins. Losing potential high-profile events could hurt everyone who worked here, not just Ronald. Actually, she found herself saying, the Silver Spoon does have some excellent staff who treated me well. She glanced toward the kitchen where Miguel and several others were pretending not to watch the drama unfolding. It would be a shame if they suffered because of one person's actions. Gregory studied her face. Compassion, even for those who didn't stand up for you. You continue to impress me, Sarah. He turned back to Ronald. Perhaps there's room for redemption after all. Here's what I propose. The Blackwell Foundation will consider hosting its next event here, with conditions. Ronald nodded eagerly. Anything. First, you will implement a suspended meal program. Customers can pay for extra meals that will be provided to anyone who comes in hungry, regardless of their appearance or ability to pay. Ronald swallowed hard. That's not really our clientele. Second, Gregory continued as if he hadn't heard, you will provide paid internships for nursing students from Sarah's program who need work experience. Ellen smiled, squeezing Sarah's hand under the table. And third, you will volunteer once a month at the Blackwell Center for Homeless Veterans. I think sometimes serving others might adjust your perspective. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped pretending to work and were openly watching. If you agree to these terms, the foundation will book its spring gala here, with potential for future events depending on how sincerely you implement these changes. Gregory's tone made it clear this was his final offer. Ronald's face went through a series of emotions: shock, resentment, calculation, and finally resignation. Of course, Mr. Blackwell, the Silver Spoon would be proud to partner with your foundation on these initiatives. Gregory nodded once, then turned back to Sarah and Ellen. Now, I believe I interrupted your afternoon. My driver can take you home. Or, if you're feeling up to it, Mrs. Johnson, perhaps you might join me for an early dinner. There are details about the scholarship and medical program I'd like to discuss. Ellen straightened in her chair. I think I can manage dinner, Mr. Blackwell. Please, call me Gregory. Sarah watched this exchange with a sense of wonder. An hour ago, she'd been calculating how to make rent. Now her education was secured, her mother's treatment provided for, and even her former boss was being forced to become a better person. As they prepared to leave, Miguel approached their table hesitantly. "Sarah, can I speak with you a moment?" She stepped aside with him. "What is it, Miguel?" He twisted his hands nervously. "I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you earlier. I was scared of losing my job. My sister's baby is coming and I send money home and—" He trailed off, ashamed. Sarah touched his arm gently. "It's okay, Miguel. Really, standing up to authority is hard, especially when people depend on you." Miguel looked at her gratefully. "Are you really not coming back?" "Number. But it sounds like you'll be seeing me around when the nursing internship program starts." She smiled. "And maybe you can help make sure Ronald actually follows through on his promises." Miguel stood a little taller. "I will, I promise." As they walked toward the door, Ronald made one last attempt. "Miss Johnson, I truly regret my actions earlier. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive a momentary lapse in judgment." Sarah paused, looking him directly in the eyes. "Mr. Parker, what happened today wasn't a momentary lapse. It was just the first time someone with power noticed how you treat people you think don't matter." Ronald flinched as if she'd slapped him. "But everyone deserves a second chance," Sarah continued. "Even you." Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Thomas held the Rolls-Royce door open as Ellen carefully settled into the back seat. Before Sarah could follow, Gregory touched her elbow. "That was gracious of you," he said quietly. "Ronald deserved your anger, not your compassion." Sarah thought about it for a moment. Anger feels good in the moment, but it doesn't change anything. Maybe compassion with consequences will. Gregory smiled. "You're wise beyond your years, Sarah Johnson." She shook her head. "Not wise, just my mother's daughter." As the Rolls-Royce pulled away from the curb, Sarah caught a glimpse of Ronald watching from the restaurant window. For a moment, their eyes met, and she nodded slightly. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement of the potential for change. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind. Gregory's foundation moved with astonishing efficiency. Ellen was scheduled for an evaluation at Boston Memorial's oncology department, where a new treatment protocol was discussed. Sarah's tuition bill vanished, replaced by a notification of Blackwell Foundation scholarship, full coverage, and a monthly stipend appeared in her bank account, relieving the constant pressure of financial insecurity. On a bright Tuesday morning, Sarah sat beside her mother in the hospital's garden courtyard. Ellen was finishing her first round of the new treatment, and though tired, her eyes were clearer than they had been in months. "I like him," Ellen said suddenly. "Who? Dr. Ramirez?" Sarah asked, referring to her mother's new oncologist. Ellen shook her head. "Gregory. He's a good man who remembers what it was like to struggle. That's rare in people who have wealth." Sarah nodded, thinking about the several meetings she'd had with Gregory over the past weeks, discussing her role with the foundation after graduation. He'd listened to her ideas about mobile health clinics for homeless populations with genuine interest, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. "He said something interesting yesterday," Sarah mused. "He said that his homeless disguise isn't just to test people. It's to remind himself of where he came from, to stay connected to the person he was when he had nothing." Ellen's lips curved into a smile. "Wisdom often comes from remembering our journey, not just celebrating our arrival." Sarah was about to respond when her phone chimed with a text message. She glanced down at the screen, then laughed in surprise. "What is it?" Ellen asked. "It's from Miguel. Apparently, Ronald is actually going through with the changes. They served their first suspended meal yesterday." She showed her mother the photo Miguel had sent. Ronald awkwardly serving soup to an elderly woman whose clothes had seen better days. "He looks uncomfortable," Ellen observed. "Growth usually is," Sarah replied. She put her phone away and took her mother's hand. "How are you feeling about starting the clinical trial tomorrow?" Ellen squeezed her daughter's fingers. Nervous, hopeful, grateful. She looked up at the blue sky above them. It's strange how life turns. One moment of kindness from you changed everything. Sarah thought about the chain of events, how a simple decision to treat someone with dignity had unlocked possibilities she never could have imagined. I think that's how the world works sometimes. Small actions, big ripples. As they sat together in the peaceful garden, Sarah noticed a hospital volunteer pushing an elderly patient in a wheelchair down the path. The volunteer was gentle, speaking quietly to the patient, adjusting a blanket with care. It was Ronald Parker. He saw them and hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to approach or retreat. After a moment's deliberation, he continued forward. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson, Sarah," he said, his usual confidence notably absent. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Ellen replied graciously. "Are you volunteering here now?" Ronald nodded. "Every Tuesday and Thursday. Mr. Blackwell thought it would complement my experience at the Veterans Center." He cleared his throat. "Actually, I'm glad I ran into you. I wanted to tell you that we've implemented all the changes we discussed. The suspended meal program is going well. We've already provided over 30 meals to people in need." "Miguel sent me a photo," Sarah said. "That's wonderful." "Yes, well." Ronald shifted uncomfortably. "It's been educational." He glanced at the elderly woman in the wheelchair, who was dozing peacefully. "I should continue our walk. Mrs. Simmons enjoys the sunshine." As he began to push the wheelchair away, he paused and turned back. "Sarah, the nursing internship program is ready whenever your school is. I've spoken with the dean about potential candidates." 3 months later, Sarah stood in her graduation cap and gown, searching the crowd for familiar faces. The spring sunshine warmed the outdoor ceremony at Boston University's School of Nursing. When she spotted her mother sitting beside Gregory in the family section, she waved excitedly. Ellen looked stronger than she had in months. The new treatment protocol had reduced her tumor by 30%, and though she still had a long road ahead, her doctors were cautiously optimistic. Today, she wore a new blue dress and a colorful scarf that concealed the effects of her treatment. More importantly, she sat without the wheelchair they'd relied on just weeks ago. "Sarah Johnson," the dean called, and Sarah walked across the stage to receive her diploma. A cheer rose from one section of the audience. Sarah grinned when she saw Miguel, alongside several other Silver Spoon staff members, standing and applauding. Even Ronald was there, clapping with surprising enthusiasm. The restaurant had closed for lunch to allow the staff to attend. When the ceremony ended, Sarah made her way through the crowd to find her mother and Gregory. "I'm so proud of you," Ellen said, embracing her daughter carefully. "We both are," Gregory added, his eyes twinkling. He handed her a small wrapped package, a graduation gift. Sarah opened it to find a silver caduceus pin, similar to the pendant her mother had given her but more elaborate. Small sapphires formed the eyes of the twin serpents. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Read the inscription," Gregory suggested. Sarah turned the pin over. Engraved on the back were the words, "Small kindnesses, great changes." She looked up at Gregory, touched by the sentiment. "Thank you. For everything." "You earned it," he replied simply. "All of it." As they walked toward the parking area where Thomas waited with the car, Gregory outlined the next steps for Sarah's role at the foundation. "The mobile clinic program you proposed has been approved by the board. We've ordered 2 medical vans that will be retrofitted according to your specifications. They should be ready by the time you complete your state boards." Sarah could hardly believe how quickly things were moving. "And the staff?" "We've secured commitments from 2 doctors who will volunteer their time, and funding for 3 full-time nurses, with you as the program coordinator if you're still interested." "Absolutely," Sarah confirmed. The mobile clinics had been her dream, bringing healthcare directly to homeless populations who often avoided hospitals until their conditions became critical. As they approached the car, Sarah was surprised to see Ronald Parker waiting nearby, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. "Mr. Parker," she acknowledged, curious about his presence. "Congratulations, Sarah," he said, offering a small gift bag. "Just a little something from the Silver Spoon team." Inside was a framed photograph of Sarah with Miguel and the other staff, taken during one of the nursing internship sessions. They had signed the mat with personal messages. Miguel had written, "Thank you for teaching me that courage doesn't have to be loud." "This is very thoughtful," Sarah said, genuinely moved. "Thank you." Ronald cleared his throat. "Actually, there's something else I wanted to discuss with you both." He glanced at Gregory. "With your permission, of course, Mr. Blackwell." Gregory nodded, curious. "The Silver Spoon has been implementing the suspended meal program for 3 months now," Ronald began. "It's been more successful than I anticipated. We've served over 200 meals to people in need." "That's wonderful," Ellen said warmly. "Yes, well, it's also changed something in our regular customers. They've embraced the program, often adding extra meals to their bills." Ronald straightened his ever-present blue tie. "I've been thinking about taking it further. I'd like to propose a partnership with your mobile clinic program, Sarah." Sarah raised her eyebrows, intrigued. "What kind of partnership?" "Once a week, we could prepare fresh, nutritious meals to be distributed from the mobile clinics. Restaurant-quality food, not just the usual soup kitchen fare." Ronald's eyes held a spark of genuine enthusiasm. "Our chefs are excited about the idea. Even our suppliers have offered to donate ingredients." Gregory exchanged a look with Sarah. "That's actually an excellent idea, Ronald. Nutrition is a critical component of healthcare that's often overlooked in homeless services." "The idea came from my volunteer work," Ronald admitted. "I've noticed how many health issues stem from poor nutrition and dignified food service." He paused, a flash of humility crossing his face. "Well, it matters more than I understood before." Sarah studied the man before her. Ronald Parker was still Ronald Parker. His tie was perfectly knotted, his shoes immaculately shined. But something fundamental had shifted in him. The experience of serving others had done exactly what Gregory had hoped. It had changed his perspective. "I think that's a wonderful proposal," Sarah said finally. "We could coordinate the food service with basic health screenings." Ronald nodded eagerly. "I've already spoken with Miguel and the kitchen staff. They're willing to work on their days off to make this happen." "Paid days, I hope?" Gregory asked pointedly. "Of course," Ronald responded quickly. "The restaurant will cover all costs. It's the least we can do." After finalizing some details, Ronald excused himself to rejoin his staff. As he walked away, Ellen watched him thoughtfully. "You've changed that man's life," she said to Sarah and Gregory. "Both of you." "He changed his own life," Gregory corrected gently. "We just provided the opportunity." That evening, Sarah sat with her mother on their small apartment balcony. The same apartment that had once felt like a trap now served as a comfortable temporary home until Ellen's treatment was complete. Then they would move to a ground-floor unit in a building closer to the hospital, another arrangement from Gregory that they had gratefully accepted. "I got a message from Mrs. Wellington today," Sarah mentioned, scrolling through her phone. "She's offering to fund a scholarship for nursing students interested in community health. She wants to name it after you." Ellen laughed softly. "After me? What did I do?" "Raised a daughter who wouldn't let someone go hungry." Sarah squeezed her mother's hand. "Everything good in me came from you." Ellen shook her head. "No, sweetheart. You brought your own light into this world. I just tried not to dim it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from blue to purple to deep indigo. City lights blinked on around them, creating a constellation of human presence. "Do you remember that night when you were 7?" Ellen asked suddenly. "When we had nothing but half a loaf of bread and some peanut butter?" Sarah nodded. She remembered it clearly, the month after her father left, before Ellen had found steady work. "You saw that woman digging through our apartment building's dumpster. You insisted we share our bread with her." Ellen's eyes grew distant with the memory. "I was so angry at first. We barely had enough for ourselves." "You did it anyway," Sarah recalled, "because you were right. Having nothing doesn't excuse doing nothing for someone with even less. Ellen looked at her daughter. Today, watching you graduate, I kept thinking about that moment, how it shaped who you became. Sarah thought about the chain of events that had led them here. A simple act of kindness in a restaurant, a wealthy man disguised as someone in need, a transformation that had rippled outward to affect so many lives. I think we're all just one kindness away from a different life, she said softly, for better or worse. As darkness settled over the city, Sarah's phone lit up with another message. It was from Gregory. Board meeting approved full funding for 5 years of mobile clinics. Construction begins next week on the Blackwell-Johnson Health Initiative building. Ellen's name belongs on this project, too. After all, she raised the woman who reminded me of my purpose. Sarah showed the message to her mother, whose eyes filled with tears. From half a loaf of bread to this, Ellen whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You never know where kindness will lead. Sarah tucked the phone away and took her mother's hand. Together they watched the stars appear, tiny points of light piercing the darkness, each one a reminder that even the smallest spark matters in a world that can sometimes seem overwhelmingly dark. The Blackwell-Johnson Mobile Health Clinic gleamed in the morning sunlight, its white exterior adorned with a simple logo, a caduceus intertwined with an olive branch. Sarah checked the supplies one last time before their day began. Blood pressure cuffs, basic medications, wound care kits, hygiene supplies, everything was in place. Ready for another day? Dr. Martinez asked, climbing aboard with 2 coffee cups. He handed one to Sarah. Always, she replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. 1 year into the program, they had established a rhythm and route that allowed them to reach hundreds of Boston's homeless population each week. Miguel pulled up in the Silver Spoon's delivery van, its familiar logo now accompanied by a smaller version of the clinic's emblem. He and another kitchen staff member unloaded thermal containers of hot, nutritious breakfast. Good morning, Nurse Johnson, Miguel called cheerfully. In the past year, he had been promoted to assistant manager at the restaurant, but still insisted on personally handling the clinic deliveries twice a week. Morning, Miguel. How's the restaurant? Busy. We're hosting the Blackwell Foundation Summer Gala next week. Ronald is driving everyone crazy with preparations. Miguel grinned. He wants everything to be perfect. The Silver Spoon had undergone its own transformation. What had begun as Gregory's conditions for redemption had evolved into a genuine mission. The suspended meal program had expanded to include weekly community dinners where homeless guests were served with the same dignity as paying customers. Ronald's initial discomfort had gradually given way to pride in the restaurant's new purpose. As they set up the breakfast station beside the clinic, Sarah spotted a familiar figure approaching. Ellen, walking slowly but steadily without assistance. After completing her treatment protocol 6 months ago, she had received the news they'd all been hoping for: remission. Though she would need regular monitoring for years to come, she had regained enough strength to volunteer with the foundation part-time. Mom, you're early today, Sarah called out. Ellen smiled, her face fuller than it had been during treatment, her eyes bright. Gregory's dropping by. I thought I'd better get here before the crowds. As if summoned by her words, the distinctive Rolls-Royce appeared at the corner, but instead of Thomas, it was Gregory himself behind the wheel. He parked and approached them carrying a large bakery box. Good morning, everyone, he greeted them, setting the box on the serving table. Fresh pastries from that bakery Ellen loves in Cambridge. You didn't have to drive across town for those, Ellen scolded gently, but her pleased smile betrayed her. I wanted to, Gregory replied simply. Over the past year, his friendship with Ellen had deepened into something more, a tender, unhurried companionship between 2 people who understood both hardship and joy. Sarah watched their interaction with quiet satisfaction. Her mother deserved happiness, and Gregory's steady presence had brought a peace to Ellen's life that had been missing for decades. The first clients began arriving. Men and women of various ages, some regulars who came weekly for checkups, others new faces drawn by word of mouth about a place where they would be treated with respect regardless of their circumstances. Sarah checked blood pressures, dressed wounds, administered medications, and listened. really listened, to each person who came through the clinic's doors. Every interaction reinforced what she had learned that day at the Silver Spoon. Dignity was as essential to healing as any medicine. "Quite an operation you've built here," came a voice from the clinic entrance. Sarah looked up to see Ronald Parker, impeccably dressed as always, but now with a warmth in his eyes that had once been absent. "It's a team effort," Sarah replied, finishing up with her current patient. Ronald nodded to several familiar faces among the homeless clients, people he now knew by name from the restaurant's community dinners. "The foundation board meeting went well yesterday. They've approved funding for 2 more mobile clinics." "I heard," Sarah said. "Gregory mentioned you were quite the advocate." Ronald looked almost embarrassed. "I simply presented the data. The results speak for themselves." And they did. In 1 year, the clinic had provided basic health care to over 3,000 people, connecting hundreds to long-term medical services, housing assistance, and addiction treatment. The partnership with the Silver Spoon had ensured that nutritional needs were addressed alongside medical ones. As Ronald helped Miguel set up the breakfast service, Sarah stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The city was fully awake now, people hurrying to offices and appointments, most never noticing the invisible population that Sarah and her team served. A young woman approached hesitantly, clutching a small child to her chest. The baby was fussing, clearly in discomfort, and the mother looked exhausted and frightened. "Can you help us?" she asked softly. "My son has a fever. I don't have insurance, and the emergency room—" She trailed off, the rest of the sentence unnecessary. "Of course we can help," Sarah assured her, guiding her toward the clinic steps. "What's your name?" "Jessica," the woman replied. "And this is Max." As Sarah helped them aboard, she caught a glimpse of herself in the clinic's reflection, the caduceus pin from Gregory gleaming on her scrubs, her mother's pendant still worn beneath. 2 symbols of the same truth: small kindnesses, great changes. Inside, the team worked together seamlessly. Dr. Martinez examined the baby while Ellen gently took Jessica's history. Gregory appeared with a warm meal from the Silver Spoon's provisions. Miguel produced a clean baby blanket from their supplies. "Max has an ear infection," Dr. Martinez explained after his examination. "We have the antibiotics he needs right here." Relief washed over Jessica's face. "How much will it cost?" "Nothing," Sarah told her. "That's not how we work here." Later, as Jessica prepared to leave with a sleeping, medicated Max, proper food in her stomach, and information about housing assistance in her pocket, she turned to Sarah. "Why are you doing this? Helping people like us?" Sarah thought about Gregory's test at the restaurant, about her mother sharing their last bread, about the chain of kindness that had brought them all to this moment. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it," she said simply, "and someone helped them before that. It's how things should work." As the day progressed and more people came for help, Sarah caught Ronald watching the operation with thoughtful eyes. "It's quite different from managing a restaurant," she commented. "Not as different as you might think," he replied. "Both are about service, ultimately." "I just had the priorities wrong before." He straightened his tie. "Some habits never changed. I've been meaning to tell you. The restaurant is starting an employment program for people transitioning out of homelessness. Kitchen positions, dishwashing, eventually server roles for those who are interested." "That's wonderful, Ronald," Sarah said, genuinely impressed by how far he had come. He shrugged. "Small kindnesses, as Mr. Blackwell says." As the afternoon wound down, Sarah found herself standing with Gregory, Ellen, and Ronald, watching the city from the clinic's steps. 1 year ago today, Gregory remarked quietly, a waitress refused to let a homeless man go hungry. Look what happened. Ellen leaned gently against his shoulder. The best kind of ripple effect. "I've been thinking," Ronald said, uncharacteristically hesitant, "about that day. I was so concerned with status, with appearances. I couldn't see past my own prejudices." "But you learned," Sarah pointed out. "Because I had to," Ronald admitted. "But you already knew what took me months to understand, that how we treat the most vulnerable among us defines who we are." Gregory nodded in agreement. It's a lesson I relearn every day. He looked at Sarah. Some people never need the reminder. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street, Sarah thought about the countless lives touched by what had begun as a simple stand for human dignity. Her own family's circumstances transformed, Ronald's perspectives shifted, the silver spoon repurposed, and hundreds of vulnerable people helped. A passing businessman dropped some coins into their donation jar, hurrying on without breaking stride. A small kindness, barely noticed but added to all the others that made their work possible. "Ready to pack up?" Dr. Martinez called from inside the clinic. "Just a minute," Sarah replied. She took one more moment to appreciate the scene before her. Her mother, healthy and happy, Gregory with his hand gently supporting Ellen's elbow, Ronald helping Miguel load the last of the food containers, Jessica and baby Max walking toward their bus stop with renewed hope. One meal covered for a homeless man who wasn't homeless at all. One moment of standing up against injustice. One decision to see humanity where others saw only inconvenience. Sarah touched her caduceus pin and smiled. Sometimes the smallest moments changed everything. For now, that was enough. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of love to break down walls and bridge any divide. Please do comment your feedback and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of family, redemption, and the triumph of love over pride. Remember, it's never too late to change your story.